This episode discusses violence, crime scenes, autopsy, and homicide. Listener discretion is advised. A note for listeners. There is more to this story than we could possibly cover in one episode. The story of how Ina Jane Doe was identified as Susan Minard Lund is primarily the basis for my book, Lay Them to Rest. In Lay Them to Rest, you can learn more about that journey and about the forensic science used to identify John and Jane Does. Sue's disappearance is covered in more detail in the book as well. This is The Fall Line. On December 24th, 1992, Susan Minard Lund disappeared. She'd recently moved to Clarksville, Tennessee with her family, 3 young children and her husband, Paul Sr., who was in the Army. He was stationed at Fort Campbell, and if you're unfamiliar, that's just over the border in Kentucky. Paul Lund Sr. was a specialist with the Military Intelligence Battalion, and Sue was a stay-at-home mother, at least for the time being. Sue was 25 years old, and originally from Indiana. She was the second youngest of 5 children. Growing up, she was most known for her intense love of animals. She'd do anything to save a creature from harm, and she went out of her way to pet every dog or cat that she saw, even the fiercest ones. One of her oldest sisters, Anne-Marie, thought of that as one of Sue's defining characteristics. That and Sue's love of children.
I strongly believe she would have been like a vet, something to do with animals, to take care of them. She had compassion beyond belief. These animals, no matter how big, how small, what they were, it seems like she could just reach down and pet them. Same thing with the deers. I mean, she'd feed them when we go camping and stuff. She was just amazing with animals. And after a while, my father did tell her that she couldn't bring any more home. And she'd say, well, they're just following me. And it was true.
When Sue had her kids, she passed on her love of animals to them. Her middle daughter, Crystal, was only 4 years old when her mother vanished, but she still has clear memories of their shared love for rescuing and loving pets.
What I remember, she loved taking us on walks and taking us to, I believe it was Dairy Queen, or maybe even a little ice cream shop in town. We were on a walk, and we stumbled upon a little kitten, and I wanted it so badly. It was a little orange kitten. My mom crawled under the shed or a trailer. I can't remember what it was. And she got this little kitten out for me. And I named him Baby. I had him until he was like 8 years old.
That loving nature was what sealed it for Anne-Marie. When she found out that their sister had been reported missing, she was sure, from the start, that something terrible had happened.
She was just as great with her children as she was with animals. She loved them kids. She would have never, ever, ever leave them kids.
When the Lund family came to Tennessee, they moved to off-base housing on Harris Court that didn't have television or a phone. The couple also didn't have a car. They had to walk everywhere or get rides from Paul's buddies. His friends would take him to pick up the family's groceries for the week. If Sue wanted to call her sisters, she had to walk down to the convenience store and use the payphone. It was something that she did often. Her sister Pam was one of her best friends, and she also talked to Anne-Marie and her parents often too. She also checked in with her other siblings and her best friend back home. She was trying to keep up connections. Without a TV to entertain the kids, and with little spending money on hand, Sue would take them on nature walks, long, meandering strolls around their town with their pet dogs to do some exploring. Her sister Pam told me that Sue was enjoying all that time with her children, just getting to watch them grow and change. It was one of the first times that she'd stayed home with them for any length of time. See, she'd worked back in Indiana when Paul was stationed in Germany. Her sister Pam told me that Sue and the kids, they'd lived with her for some of that time. Pam and Sue, they'd trade off work shifts and childcare duty so that they could make ends meet, and so that someone was always with the kids. Paul and Sue met at an arcade back in Highland, Indiana, when she was still in high school. He was just a few years older. and they married when she was 18, and then had 3 children under 6 by the time that she was 25. He was stationed in Germany for a lot of that time. The move to Clarksville in the fall of 1992 was a mixed bag for Sue. She missed her family and her friends and the support system that she had back in Indiana. But she loved the town. It felt a little more country, as she described it. She did tell her sisters that she was thinking of getting a job. As much as she treasured spending time with the kids, she was worried about money. She told Pam that there was not enough to get them all the gifts that she'd hoped for Christmas, and they felt disconnected from family too. Things would be easier when they had a phone, sure. One was supposed to be installed the first week of January, but they still needed a car, and so much more. Paul Sr., he was gone a lot too, and he was reliant on rides from fellow soldiers. And if Sue needed something, she would have to take a walk to retrieve it. Clarksville surely had a few cabs, but again, money was tight. We know a few things for sure about December 24th, 1992, but the rest is up for debate or for interpretation. There's what the local news reported, what Sue's family back in Indiana understood to be true, and what her middle daughter, Crystal, remembers. But she was only 4 years old at the time. So many of the questions might be answered by Paul Sr., but he passed away just a few years ago, before Sue was identified. So, the family members most active in Sue's case, Crystal and Sue's sisters Pam and Anne-Marie, they've gone back over it all again and again. But still, they have those questions. I've never gotten access to the Tennessee police records regarding Sue's case, so all the gathered research has come from local news from the time and from her family. The early reports vary in their details, so some things, they just aren't certain. But as best as we can figure, the official record goes something like this. According to the Leaf Chronicle, Sue was last seen on Christmas Eve when she left the house at around 7:30 p.m. According to her husband, she decided to walk to the grocery store to buy ingredients to make pumpkin pie for the next day's meal. The grocery store that the family frequented was about 3.5 miles away, or a 7-mile round trip from their home. It was cold that night, at least for the southeast. Historical weather records indicate highs in the upper 20s. When I looked into it later, I found out that the Winn-Dixie was actually closed that night. But the Lund family would not have necessarily known that, considering that they didn't have a phone or a TV. And then there's this. Paul Sr. later told reporters that Sue was 3 months pregnant at the time that she took this walk. However, she had not told her sisters or any other family that information, so they were not able to confirm that fact. We don't know if any neighbors saw Sue or could verify that she was walking around that time, in any direction, but we do have an earlier time marker in the same day. It is certain that Sue did take a walk at around 5 or 6 p.m. to the payphone at the convenience store. If there are witnesses who saw her, it's possible that they might have spotted her then. It was about a mile's distance from her home. Sue went there to call her sister Pam, and Pam knows it was around 5 or 6 p.m. because she had a pizza delivery that interrupted the phone call. She fed her kids dinner while she and her sister chatted. And she also remembered this because the delivery driver was a high school friend of them both, and she actually put him on the phone to say hi to Sue. While they talked, Pam asked Sue what she was making for Christmas dinner, and Pam recalled that Sue said nothing special. Paul had already gotten the family's groceries on a run with his friend, so that's why Pam was surprised later on when she heard that Sue had decided to go out that night and buy ingredients for a pie. They'd never discussed it. But as Sue's daughter Crystal and I discussed years later, people do change their minds. We just don't know exactly what went on that evening. We can't even know for sure that Sue had definitely planned on going to the Winn-Dixie. If she decided on a pie, maybe that's what was assumed because she said store. But what if she'd thought to walk down to the convenience store instead to see if they had a can of pie filling and a crust on hand? A local reporter told us that there was also a closer grocery store, and if Sue knew about that, it might have been an option too. Again, Sue's daughter Crystal, she only vaguely remembers that night. She was only 4, after all. And she says that it's really hard to tell the difference between memories and family stories and what she's heard recounted by others. But that said, she thinks she can recall a few key details.
I remember someone telling me this, but I feel like it's true that she wanted to get a pumpkin pie for Christmas. And I remember getting angry because I wanted to go with her, and they kept telling me, oh, next time to go. So I'm thinking I used to go on walks with her quite often to the stores, but for some reason that night was different. Could have been because it was cold or because it was late.
You also told me before that it would have probably been close to your bedtime because you kind of remembered it being maybe dark outside.
Yes, it was dark, and we was in our pajamas. I'm not sure why I remember this so clearly, because I think I wanted to go with her so badly, and that bothers me a lot, not knowing what would happen if I did want with her.
What we do know for sure is that the last time that anyone in the family saw or spoke to Sue Lund was December 24th, 1992. Her husband, Paul Sr., told the local papers that he expected her back that evening, but that she didn't return. News reports are inconsistent regarding when Sue was actually reported missing. One article wrote that Paul Sr. called police that evening, and another stated that he reported her missing on Monday, December 28th. But that discrepancy, it might simply have to do with a call versus a filed formal report for a missing adult. It's hard to say. Sue's family came from Indiana as soon as they could. Her mother, her father, and her sister Anne Marie. It was an 8-hour drive, and they planned to look for Sue. But when they arrived, they were first questioned by authorities. There were eventually several agencies involved in this case: military police, the local law enforcement, and, according to Anne-Marie, the TBI. Anne-Marie remembers speaking to a number of different officials. The family, they were ready to help, but the tone of the interviews was surprising to them.
At that time, we did get interrogated by the police, and we had to go down to, I believe it was the courthouse, because they took me, my father, my mother in different rooms and had questioned us, like, where were you? Did you fight with your sister? And like, almost like they were blaming us that she was missing. And that was a little hard to take. They grilled us. I won't say they didn't. And sometimes you watch it on TV, like I'm always watching Dateline and all that stuff on TV, always when there's any of that. Because the more information I can gather, maybe there is something in my back of my mind that might help them, and it was hard. Your emotions run rampant. Your mind is like a million miles away trying to gather all this information in, and sometimes it just came out in tears.
As soon as the interviews were over, the family rushed to make flyers. They described Sue's bright red hair and her brown eyes and her 5-foot frame. There's actually still a photo of the handwritten plea that they included. Maybe it was written out by one of the oldest children. It said, "Come home. We love you. We miss you. Mommy, we love you." Then they got to work. Some of Paul's local family watched the kids, and neighbors they pitched into. But Anne-Marie and her parents, they were out everywhere that they could be, not just posting flyers, but also searching. They were afraid of what they might find, because they knew, before they started, that Sue Lund would never voluntarily leave.
Who was helping you search? Was it the community? Was it law enforcement, family?
No, it was just me, my mom, and my dad. There was nobody else willing to help us. We made maybe over 100 flyers, stopped at every business, within a 1 or 2 mile radius, either way of where her house was. We went into parks. We went into the fields. Opening up bags in a field was hard because you didn't know what you were going to come upon. Had I known the place that we went had snakes running around, I probably at that time would have been a little skittish, but we didn't know at that time the fields that we went through looking for her. I can remember the Waffle House because I walked in with these flyers and I told them that my sister is missing from here. Can we put up a flyer? And they said yes. Same thing with the Moose Club, because my father and I and my mom were Moose members. We went to the club where we felt like we were with family because they were all concerned. And yes, they put up flyers and they had maybe 200 members. They were going to have a meeting, tell their members to get the flyers out. Sometimes it got overwhelming. And especially when we had to leave, that was one of the hardest things because I felt like we were giving up on her. But we never did. Never, ever gave up. But coming home was a real challenge because then it was every day was on your mind. Would we hear her say our name in a crowd? Could you think you just spotted somebody that looked like her? So I would say coming home was a torture.
Though Sue's family had searched alone, local media did report on law enforcement's efforts. Per the Clarksville Leaf-Chronicle, local authorities conducted an investigation that cost, quote, more than $5,000 in its first week, and this included polygraphs, helicopter sweeps, and land searches. The polygraphs mentioned by police were reportedly administered to Paul Sr. himself, and we aren't sure if anyone else was tested. Sue's disappearance was well covered in the local media, but even early on, the tone of that coverage seemed off, at least in terms of its undercurrents. Part of that came from a flurry of alleged sightings that came in from Nashville and parts of Kentucky. People who claimed that they'd spotted Sue all over the place. The implication was that she might have run away versus vanished against her will, or even met with an accident. Paul Sr. told reporters that he didn't think that she'd left on her own. He said he was trying to remain hopeful, and though he was prepared for the worst, quote, he hoped that she'd come home real soon. If I were to come back home and she was sitting on the couch, there'd be no questions. I would hug her. But within weeks, local police began openly stating that they believed that she was most likely alive, and probably in Kentucky. A February 1993 Leaf Chronicle article reported that then police captain Doug Pechtel said, quote, she was up there on December 30th. We've got the police up there spot-checking places for us. Hopefully, that's her. Per the Chronicle, quote, police concluded that Mrs. Lund is in Hopkinsville after Sergeant Billy Poore and Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agent Jeff Puckett traveled there last week. Police told the Chronicle they have no plans to arrest her. This kind of reporting was what was filtering down to Sue's children. They heard the whispers that she'd run off to Nashville, to Kentucky, that she'd left them. Crystal mostly remembers it as an incredibly confusing time.
I do remember looking at my mother's picture and saying she'll be back soon. I really believe she was going to come home. I remember any woman with dark red hair, I would run up to and ask if she was my mom. It could be at the park, at the pool. In my child mind, my mom had red hair. And if I kept asking all these women with red hair, I would eventually find her.
The news of Sue's case, it eventually drifted away from the newspapers. That is, until the later summer of 1993, when a strange development occurred. A woman in Alabama called Clarksville authorities, and she claimed that she was Sue Lund. She wanted to be removed from their list of missing persons. According to the Montgomery Advertiser, an officer, quote, spent time in a small Mideastern Alabama town in early July to verify her story. And then police, quote, closed their investigation. They were satisfied that this woman was Sue Lund, and no further action was taken. After all, an adult can leave at any time and cannot be forced to return home. There was just one problem with this case closure. That woman, whomever she was definitely not Susan Minard Lund. On January 27th, 1993, in a state park in Jefferson County, Illinois, the partial remains of a woman were discovered. That woman was Sue. Only her head and several vertebrae were found off a little-used road in a far-flung corner of the park. Authorities estimated that she'd been dead anywhere from a few days to over a week. It was hundreds of miles from Clarksville, Tennessee, and it was a month after her disappearance. And it was long before that call from Alabama ever came. The cause of her death was ruled a homicide, and we still have no definitive answers as to what happened between December 24th and that day in January, though there is a lot more to the story of how she was identified. But certainly, one of the reasons her family had to wait 30 years was because her case was closed. Sue Lund was not in any missing persons database. There was never a chance to compare the decedent known as Ina Jane Doe to Susan Minard Lund. Her maternal family, back in Indiana, they weren't even living so far away from that park, but they never knew to look there.
One of the things that I think has been across the board most shocking for anyone that's heard of Sue's case is that her case was closed in the late summer of 1993, about 8 months after she disappeared. What do you remember about that report that came from Alabama of the woman claiming to be Sue?
Well, it was not Sue. It's just my opinion, and I'm sorry. I don't think the police really took it seriously or investigated it.
But no one on your side of the family ever believed that, even at the time, right?
No, we didn't believe it at all. When you go through life and you have somebody that's missing, a sister, sibling, whatever it may be, you always in the back of your mind think, well, maybe I'll see them, or maybe if they're being held against their will, maybe I'll see them in this crowd. Nobody can just vanish off the face of the earth. It's unbelievable, these situations. It's hard. And when you go through life and it happens to you, you happen to cherish life a little bit more. Sue never got to cherish her kids. We're doing that for her. The woman that claimed that she was Sue, it didn't have the same social security number. Nothing was the same. So her pretending she was Sue was wrong. I think they should be questioning her too. Why would you do that?
How did the closure of her case, all the way back in 93, make it more difficult for you, for Pam and your parents, and for everyone who still wanted to continue that search? How did that case closure put blocks in your way?
It put a lot of blocks because they wouldn't let us do certain things, or they wouldn't answer any more questions because they had the case closed.
And I think that's something that you and your family kept in mind because you didn't give up. Even though Sue's case was closed to you and you couldn't use the traditional routes to try and find her. Can you talk a little bit about how you and your sister kept looking?
Yes, we kept looking because we kept talking about it all the time to anybody that would listen. She deserves to be at home with her kids, whether she's living or dead. They can play a place to grieve instead of being told throughout their life that she just left when she didn't just leave.
Sue's husband and children left Clarksville after the case was closed. They went to Virginia, where his family was living, so he'd have help with the kids. And Crystal felt like she was on a constant watch out for her mother, always wondering if she'd show up and reclaim them. They couldn't have known that in Illinois, detectives had been trying to solve their mother's murder and identify her for what would be weeks, and then months, and then years. So I know you don't have much memory of the investigation at all, but I know you do remember that y'all didn't stay in Tennessee for very long. Do you remember moving to Virginia?
I remember bits and pieces of moving to Virginia. My dad's cousin and his wife came to get us. I was upset about that because for some reason we did not bring Sheba and Diamond, the family dogs, and we almost left Baby behind. We were getting in the car, and I looked over at the front door, and there was Baby sitting there on the doorstep. And my dad's cousin allowed me to get out to run and get him. I am not sure why that's one of the things I remember from my young childhood. I think it's because that cat meant so much to me. But after that, next thing I knew, I was in Virginia. There's a lot of blank spaces in my memories. My father's parents lived on an old farm, and they got weirded out because a black vehicle was facing the driveway, the long driveway, for days. I remember being picked up from the bus stop. So I must have been like at least 5, 6 at this point, and drove down to the house, which was weird because that only happened when we had to go to doctor appointments. Usually we would walk back down to the house, this long dirt road. And I found out some vehicle was in there staring at us while watching us. And we were not allowed to go outside and play. The police were called. And honestly, I had no clue what came from that. And around the same time, people claimed they seen my mother in the area. So I was told my mother was sending people to come take us back, which really gave me hope that she was still out there.
What do you think about that story now? Do you have any answers as to who could have been in that car? Has anyone ever given you more detail?
No, it's still a mystery to today. I have no clue what was going on. As a child, I was told my mother was horrible, that she just abandoned us. But now that I'm older and seeing things through my own eyes, I realize I was lied to quite often. I don't know if it's to make me not dig deeper into what happened, or I honestly don't know what the motive would have been with all the lies I heard. When I became a teenager, I got so angry because I needed her. I felt like if she was out there, she pretty much abandoned me. And due to that, I felt like if she was around, none of that would have happened. And I felt like if I was with her, she would have had to protect me from all the childhood trauma we talked about before. And the anger turned to resentment. Even through all that, I still kept trying to find her. I would go onto missing people's pages. I would leave messages begging for her to come back and letting her know I was not angry at her, that I just wanted her back. I would Google her name. I would search Jane Doe's. So I actually ran across Ina Jane Doe a few times, and I did not realize it was her. Her face, it did not look like her. They kept saying this woman was disabled. And I knew my mother wasn't disabled, so that threw me off so badly with that. And I realized that he didn't just run away, because I would do background searches. I would pay money, looked up her name, and everything kept coming back to my grandparents' farm in Dispatana, Virginia, before they moved to Clarksville. That's how I determined she was no longer with us.
When Crystal says, quote, "they say she was disabled," she's largely referring to internet commenters and their interpretation of case materials, not to the experts. An early forensic anthropological analysis of Ina Jane Doe, as she was then known, the expert noticed some skeletal asymmetry and signs of what may have been torticollis, or what is sometimes known as wry neck syndrome. The forensic anthropologist had little to examine, as only Sue's skull and several vertebrae were available, and the doctors didn't make definitive indications of any conditions. Further, when forensic artists work, they have to make judgments regarding what features to highlight. It's part science and it's part feeling. And in this case, both artists who originally worked on the case chose to focus on marked facial asymmetry. The truth is, we can't know how skeletal asymmetry will truly present in life. None of us have perfectly balanced features. In Sue's case, it turned out to be slight. So slight that the art produced in the early 90s was simply unrecognizable to her family. She was also estimated to be much older, 35 to 55, than she actually was. The background on that is a little more complex, and it's something I get into in more detail in the book on her case. Ina Jane Doe was eventually identified as Sue Lund via forensic investigative genetic genealogy in February of 2022. She was identified by the genealogist at Redgrave Research. When we were working on tracking down the relatives who would be contacted by law enforcement, we looked at public social media posts, and Pam and Anne-Marie were two of the first people who we came across. They'd been posting about Jane Doe's on each other's Facebook feeds, sharing photos back and forth. It had gone on for a long time. One of the first things we saw were you and Pam talking about Doe cases back and forth on Facebook.
Yes.
As recently as a month or two before she was identified.
Yes, because we never gave up.
So Pam got a call from Jefferson County Sheriff's Office in February of 2022. And I believe she called you about right away after that.
Well, I'd probably say within 2 minutes she called me.
She had to pull over to the side of
Yep.
the road. Yeah.
Yep. It hit her that hard.
I don't think that many people have considered what that experience is like, to be told that their loved one has been identified.
It was a comfortable feeling when we found out that she was found. However, when they told us that it was just the head, that was a little more, I would say the word would be gut-wrenching, because then you got all kinds of questions because you just don't know what happened. And that's the hard part. When they said they found her, we're thinking, okay, it's a body. We'll deal with it. We'll go through all this motions. But when they said it was just the head and they took our DNA that we did these tests to get that to positive ID her, that was hard. But when they said it was just her head, that was like, what do you mean? Where's the rest of her? I don't wish that on any family. And for the other families that are going through it, if they ever wanted to talk, I'm here.
Finding out about the violence of Sue's case, that not all of her was coming home, and that they still had an open murder case to deal with, Anne-Marie and Pam had to process that, and had to tell the rest of their family a complicated story, that they finally knew what had happened to Sue. But then again, they didn't know. At least, not everything. They'd still be looking and waiting.
Let's talk about the press conference for a second, because that's where we first met. Y'all showed me pictures of Sue, and that you had been through a fire and a flood with, managed to save. And we just ate together and talked, and then we went to the press conference. The press conference was mostly to talk about Susie's identification, but at the end they said they weren't going to be answering a lot of questions. It was an open homicide investigation, but that it was going to be now the purview of Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, who had done, in my opinion, a really solid job on her identification case. I know that you and Pam had really expressed that you felt a lot of relief that she'd been identified, so her kids knew that she never ran away, that she always loved them, that she would have been with them if she could have been. But at that point, were you feeling hopeful that her case was going to be actively pursued? Is that how you were feeling at that time?
Oh yeah, they made us feel welcome. It was a little scary. I've never been in a situation like that, so that was my very first time. But I can tell you, it gave us some hope. But I'm glad that they opened up for a little bit. I'm glad that they're still looking at. But if they are, why can't the detectives just call us once in a while? After all, it's my family member. I can help you. I could come down there. We could, go over everything. I'd be willing to do any of that just so we can get some answers.
Crystal, who lives in Canada, couldn't attend the press conference, but she watched everything unfold online. Some people were incredibly supportive and kind. Tips and suggestions came in. But some of the other comments were a shock. People flocked to speculate about her family, to mock the original forensic art, and to guess about who'd killed her mother, tossing out names of friends, of relatives, even serial killers. It was overwhelming, and after the initial flurry of news coverage, she didn't hear much about the investigation at all.
It was very frustrating, especially with people's opinions. Opinions about why she left, what happened, who done it. People accusing people about what happened. And the rude comments about the original artwork. I ran across another TikTok video about people making fun of it still. Thankfully, there's a lot of good people out there who correct these people for me. But it's weird, the sadness knowing what happened to her. There's also kind of relief knowing that answers are finally being, answered. But deep down, I feel like her case has been put to the back burner by so many. And that's the most frustrating part about it.
And I know there's a lot that you would like to see further explored and a lot of things you want to see answered and a lot of things that you personally have tried to work on yourself. I know you've started a TikTok account. There are so many avenues of investigation that you personally would like to see taken on. Would you like to talk about some of those?
Yes, the big one is scoping out that lake. Because ever since that one comment on the news article came out, someone claimed to be there around that time. Her head was discovered. They claimed that they've seen a headless body with his arms up in the air going down into the water. And ever since that comment, and that's where my mind keeps going, to look there, even though it's a long shot.
And so for listeners, what we're talking about is that Rend Lake, which is at the state park where Sue's remains or partial remains were found, the lake itself wasn't searched. So something Crystal has been thinking about would be some targeted searching of the lake. The whole lake wouldn't have to be searched, we don't think.
Let's hope not.
What are some other things you'd like to see explored?
Honestly, we'd like the whole case to be reopened and everything to be relooked at, but that's in an ideal world. Sadly, we don't live in one.
As of late, Crystal has been in regular contact with the new detective assigned to her mother's case, and she's hopeful that he'll look into some of the areas that she's most interested in, a review of the Tennessee missing persons file, and of who was spoken to whom at Fort Campbell. She wants to know what they know about the neighbors back in Clarksville. Did residents actually see anything? Were there any tips regarding suspicious activity? As Crystal said, one woman claimed to have seen a body floating in Rend Lake. That was posted in a Facebook comment that appeared soon after the announcement of Sue's identity. Of course, that's social media, but hopefully someone will speak to that woman and find out what she saw. Jefferson County Sheriff's Office did an incredibly thorough job investigating the case of Ina Jane Doe when she was an unidentified person. That file is hundreds of pages long, lead after lead, experts consulted, and testing done. Sue's family hopes that energy continues into the investigation into her homicide. Because once a person is identified, then the clues finally can begin to fall into place. And they, her loved ones, they're still searching. But this time, it's for a killer. And for the rest of the remains of their mother and their sister. Anne-Marie says that it's still like they're waiting, but also dreading the next article that pops up about an unidentified woman, one whose partially skeletonized remains have been discovered in any of the regions where Sue might have been left.
I would say 55% of all my family will call me and say, hey, did you know this? Did you know that? Did you in the news? When a body comes up missing, the whole family reacts. There's phone calls being made back and forth. There's talking on the phone. There's going to their house saying, hey, did you hear this? Do you think this? So there's always going to be the hurt comes up. It'll go away, not forever. It won't go away, but it lessens. But then the minute you hear about a body part, it reopens all them wounds from the very beginning. And that's the hard part. Because yes, you want to remember, yes, you do. As the years go by, it's getting harder and harder to think that in this day and age, that you can disappear off the face of the earth and not be identified. I would just like to talk to whoever is handling the case. So maybe one family member, so you don't get bombarded. I understand that we could call you once every couple months and see if you found anything else, or let you know that we've thought, well, maybe you should ask this person, or maybe you should ask that person. Personally, I think it would help me if I can converse with one of them once every couple months. So I'm out here looking, or I'm on the internet searching things, or I see certain things they don't see. Maybe they don't catch it. Maybe it's in a local news and not the national news. The family members could help. And it would give them a way of feeling a purpose and trying to find her. You don't want to let her down.
There's been a $10,000 reward active in Sue's case since October 2023, and it never expires. That same month, the nonprofit Season of Justice sponsored a billboard campaign for Sue throughout Clarksville in hopes that anyone who'd seen her back in 1992 might come forward with information. We spoke with Crystal about those efforts and whether she feels that people might be willing to speak up now that so much time has passed.
I really, really hope they would. Especially if they want to clear their conscience or give a family peace. They just need to come forward. Hopefully they are not the ones involved, but I wish people realize just knowing this information will not get you in trouble. But it will help find who done it and why they done it.
While she waits, Anne-Marie has been working on something that she hopes will stand as a remembrance of her sister. Crystal received her mother's ashes late last year, and Anne-Marie wanted some kind of memorial here for her family in the United States. So she decided to work on an art installation to honor Sue, one to stand in the park where she was found, to remind people of the woman that she was, and not to reduce her to human remains discovered in the woods. Sue Minard Lund loved nature, and Anne-Marie wants people to look at something beautiful when they think of her.
One thing you told me was that you've been able to begin your grieving process. And I would love for you, if you're comfortable, to talk a little bit about what that means for you.
Yes, I went to a mosaic class and fell in love with mosaics. And for people who don't know what mosaic is, it's glass. and you can break it in different shards or different shapes. I used little glass pieces around a PVC pipe. Her name's on there, her love for animals. We love you. We'll never give up. I am going to write a letter to the government or to the park department for it to go before a board to construct this memorial, which I will personally take care of if it needs to be. But I don't think anything will happen to it because it's on PVC. We want to bury it into the ground. I want to go and place it by the ranger station.
Can you talk about working on this, what that's been like for you?
It's been hard because there's a lot of tears on it, but I wanted to do something nice for her. It was my way of dealing a little bit with the grief. It took me a little over 7 months to make. It's something that I've worked really hard on. Of course, nobody in the family, they don't want anything like that, and that's fine. I guess it's for me, but she deserves something, some kind of recognition for where she was found. And I just hope that wherever she is in heaven, she's looking down and she says, yeah, that's cool. I hope nobody has to experience this. It takes a toll on you after a while. That always seems like part of you is missing. And I don't think any family should have to suffer through that.
It's also a reminder to herself, and says of strength, the strength to keep going. And she wants people to see it and remember Sue, and to reach out, to say something if they know something, to help finally solve this case.
If they've heard anything, seen anything, no matter how slight it might have been, like they heard an argument, maybe one of the next door neighbors saw a fight, just say something. Ask somebody. Ask all of them. Again, somebody might say something now that was so insignificant that now it could be the biggest deal ever. Just, we're not going to give up. They're going to hear our names for the rest of our lives, because I know I'll never give up, because I believe she would never give up on us.
If you have any information in the murder of Susan Minard Lund, please contact the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office in Mount Vernon, Illinois. There's a $10,000 reward in her case. You can reach them at 618-242-TIPS. To learn more about Sue's years as the Jane Doe victim known as Ina Jane Doe, you can read my book, Lay Them to Rest, listen to my interview with Voices for Justice, or check out the press conference on YouTube. Please stay tuned for more. Her family is determined to see the second half of her case resolved. Next time on The Fall Line, an unsolved homicide case and a Jane Doe victim from Grays Harbor County, Washington. If you know of a case that should be covered on The Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is an independent podcast, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIA, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. If you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. It really helps. And please take a moment to rate and review our show in your podcast app of choice. If you'd like to support the show and the stories we cover, join us on Patreon or Apple Premium. 100% of our Patreon and Apple Premium earnings are supporting our Family Therapy Fund and actively paying for therapy for families who've appeared on the show. On Patreon, you can get early release, ad-free versions of our regular episodes for $5 a month. If you prefer Apple Premium, you can subscribe there as well. On Patreon, we also post occasional giveaways, updates, and blogs, which all patrons can enjoy starting at just $1. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laurah Norton, with additional research assistance by Brian Waters. Interviews by Brooke Hargrove, produced, engineered, and scored by Maura Curry. Content advisement by Brandy C. Williams and Vic Kennedy. And as always, our most special thanks to Liz Lipka.